Hello everyone, welcome to this channel. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in these stories. While living at my father's house, I struggled with problems that left me with no choice but to separate from my family. The simplicity of my family and scheming individuals around us led to a rift between us. We were a small family of four. My father was wealthy and we had no financial problems. Whatever we wanted was provided for us. However, there were people who plotted against my father's assets. Although my father was not naive, he knew how to play others to his advantage and keep his own interests protected. My memories from my childhood are vague, but I recall that initially we were a happy family and my parents had a good relationship. However, gradually their bonds faded. This did not happen without reason. One day, when my younger aunt came to our house and sat me next to herself, she complained to my father about her husband. While my mother placed a cup of tea on the table, she sympathized with my aunt and expressed her regret. My mom was a committed and honorable woman. She always helped her sisters when they needed it. However, my younger aunt, by some accounts, became quite demanding. Sometimes, even though I was young, I felt she came only to extract money from my family. She borrowed money under the guise of a loan but never repaid it. Similarly, other members of my maternal family did the same, and this became increasingly bothersome to my mother. My father was indifferent to this situation, which led to arguments between them. My mom was not upset about helping her family, but was displeased with their exploitation of her kindness. My maternal family's financial situation was not great. In contrast, my paternal family members were shareholders and had good jobs. My father worked in a significant government position, and his words carried a lot of weight. He was so important that he was not allowed to disclose his job title, and most people were unaware of what he did. One day, when my aunt came again seeking money, she had her family sat across from us, and she requested a large sum for her husband's work, promising to repay it by the end of the year. Initially, my mother would just acknowledge her request, and my father would support her. However, my mother eventually changed and remained silent. That night, before my aunt finished speaking, my mother jokingly said, "Well, not like you paid back the previous ones." My aunt was very upset, and her husband was no less irritated. My father gave my mother a disapproving look, but that night my mother was the only one with a smile on her face. Due to my mother's somehow inappropriate remark, my father supported my aunt's request. But since it was a large sum, he couldn't pay it all at once. My mom remained silent throughout the event, and as soon as my aunt and her husband left, the arguments began. After that, my aunt stopped coming to us for money, though she frequently visited our home. Overall, she did not cut off contact with us. However, the argument between my mother and my father caused a growing distance between them. Both were introverted and proud individuals who, after each argument, were unwilling to make amends. After every dispute, they wouldn't even greet each other for several days. When other people saw that my mother was upset and throwing various remarks, they stopped directly borrowing from us. However, from what I overheard of my father's phone conversations, he was still in contact with many people behind my mother's back. The only unresolved issue was the cold relationship between my parents, which was unsettling for me as their only daughter because I received no affection from them and was constantly caught in their conflicts and cold behavior. Years passed, and nothing improved in our family. My father tried hard to mend his relationship with my mother. He bought her flowers and joked with her, But honestly, my mother's reactions were still cold and unresponsive. For someone like my father, who was very strict, such reactions felt like an insult. My mother seemed indifferent to his efforts, as if she had become accustomed to it. Lack of communication, frowning, and even indifference had become habitual for her. Despite this, my father did not show it much and remained calm. Gradually, my father also became tired of showing affection, as he found it painful to give love without receiving anything in return. I could tell from his behavior. Whenever my father tried to organize a family trip, my mother would object and firmly say, "You three go, without me, I'm not coming." The only reason was that she didn't want to be away from the city for too long and found long trips exhausting. My mother had many mood swings, and this was not the first time. Her irritability had increased, which I honestly believe was due to the events that had happened. My father, when it came to disputes over money, would resort to physical violence and hit my mother. It's impossible to ignore the past. My mother had changed because of the suffering she had endured. Over time, my father also changed. His behavior towards my mother shifted, and they began to resemble each other. It was impossible to assign blame to just one person. Both had their faults. My mother became more reclusive, while my father's behavior grew worse. Around late autumn, past midnight, we were all worried about my father. He usually came home early, but he was extremely late that night. My mother was anxious, repeatedly checking the time until my father finally arrived home with a dishevelled appearance and his shirt buttons undone. I expected an argument between them and hoped my mother would confront him about his lateness, but she behaved very passively and went to their room without any word. It wasn't the first time my father came home late, and this behavior continued to the point where he sometimes didn't come home at all. My mother had become accustomed to it. One day, when my mother and brother went shopping, I stayed at home alone. I was supposed to go with them, but decided to stay because I was feeling unwell and didn't want the cold weather to make me worse. After shopping, we were supposed to go to my grandmother's house, but that plan was cancelled due to my illness. My mother hadn't informed my grandmother that we couldn't be coming that night, and she couldn't reach my father by phone. So I stayed home waiting for my mother and brother. About 15 minutes after they left, I heard the sound of a key turning. I stood by the door and watched nervously. It was my father coming home with my aunt. I wasn't in their line of sight, and when I realized they hadn't seen me, I went into my room and hid behind the door. My father excitedly said to my aunt, "They won't be back for a while. They're spending the night at my mother's house. So after shopping, they're going to somewhere else." My aunt was silent, and I couldn't see her expression. My body was frozen. At any moment, they could come into my room and discover me. I just prayed they wouldn't see me, as I had no idea how to react. A little later, my father asked, "Are you comfortable here?" My aunt's voice was more affected than usual as she replied, "No, I'm more comfortable at home. At least, I'm sure no one else is there but you and me." They talked a bit, conversations I couldn't have imagined between my aunt and my father. Even in my dreams, I hadn't seen anything like this. But that day, the impossible had become possible. I was paralyzed with shock upon hearing their kisses. It was inconceivable that my father would commit such a huge betrayal. My aunt was married and was now cheating on her husband with my father. They left the house early that day. After this incident, I paid closer attention to my father's behavior. He had many affairs, and since he was wealthy, many women fell into his net. One night, our lives changed dramatically. My mother discovered that my father was involved with other people. She had read all his messages, and the argument escalated to the point where my mother smashed his phone against the wall, and it was completely destroyed. My father had no defense, as my mother was right. He had betrayed her, and my mother was deeply hurt. They divorced, and during the divorce process, my brother and I became unsettled. We either stayed at my paternal grandmother's house or my maternal grandmother's house. We were unsure of our future, but eventually I stayed with my mother. My father made more effort to stay connected with my brother, frequently asking him if he wanted to stay with our mother or him. Yet he never asked me whether I wanted to stay with my mother or him. My father managed to get my brother to stay with him, and I was left with my mother. My brother didn't care much about the situation, and that's when we separated and never saw each other again. Sometimes I miss my brother, but I'm sure he will never miss me. Just as he left easily, he will easily forget me. After that incident, I realized that excessive wealth can indeed be destructive. Everyone who came to my father was only interested in his money. No one came for him. My father was aware of this situation, but he put up with it for his own satisfaction. The only person who was wronged in this was my mother. And because of this, I wanted to stay with her, and I'm glad that my father didn't try to take me away from her. However, due to the arguments we had over money and the psychological pressure from financial issues, I began to dislike wealth. When I reached the age of marriage, unlike my friends who were focused on money and wealth, I was looking for someone with whom I could have peace and who had just enough money to meet our needs, but not an excess. I wanted a simple family with a moderate lifestyle, a warm and genuine atmosphere, where people came together not just for money but truly cared for each other. I was exhausted from the stories I had experienced. Over time, I met a guy named Milad at university. At first, he was calm and reserved person. As we got closer and developed a normal friendship, I found out that he was actually a fun and calm person at the same time. As we grew closer, I was able to learn about his family from him. They were a middle-class family, and he had a strong affection for his parents. He would talk about their family traditions and the warmth among his family members, which was very strange and beautiful to me. The things Milad shared about his family made me eager to meet them. Gradually, I started liking Milad and felt he was exactly what I wanted. I began discussing him with my family. My mother was very curious to meet Milad and had no problem with my feelings for him. She said I should make my own decisions about my own life, but I still wasn't sure about Milad. I didn't know if Milad liked me back. Since I was worried about being rejected, I couldn't make the first move and tried to show my interest through my actions. Fortunately, I succeeded and Milad expressed his feelings for me. Our time together was very simple and nothing particularly special happened until we got married and started our life together. That was exactly what I wanted, a simple life with a lot of warmth. One day, when Milad came home, he looked pale and disturbed, as if something bad had happened. As soon as he saw me, he came towards me, as if he had something to say but couldn't. Seeing his behavior and the feeling he conveyed to me made me really anxious. Finally, he said, Your mother is in the hospital. She's not doing well." It was the worst news of my whole life. My mother had died of a heart attack and no one knew the reason. I was left completely alone. My grandmother was an old woman living on my grandfather's pension. My grandfather had died a long time ago and she was left alone. Her old age made me worried, especially since the grief over her daughter's death could worsen her condition. I went through a tough time. A few months after my mother's death, my grandmother passed away. I lost everyone one by one, and the only person left for me was Milad. Sometimes I thought that without Milad I would have become homeless, as I had nothing left from my family. My father had not left anything in our names, and my mother's kindness had forgiven his cruelty. No one cared about me. The only thing I had was my grandfather's small and dilapidated house. Milad, for my sake, didn't let us move to my grandmother's house, as it would remind me of painful memories. Instead, we stayed in our rented home. Several years had passed since our marriage, and nothing had changed between us. Instead, we had gained something new, a baby boy. After 3 months, I discovered I was pregnant, and a few months later, our only son was about to be born. I was very happy, and both Milad and I, despite having only each other, were very content. Milad's family was also nice, but they no longer visited us as frequently as before. We would only gather occasionally at my mother-in-law's house. My boy was about 5 years old. I had gotten through the difficult stages of childcare, and he was almost grown up and no longer a source of constant trouble. One day, when Milad came home, he was so happy that he didn't even greet me. He came in and said, "I met one of my best high school friends today." I was happy for him. It's a great feeling to reconnect with someone you haven't seen or heard from in years. Milad was so thrilled that I suggested, "Why don't you invite him over for a night so you can reconnect like before?" When I saw that Milad was smiling because of a friend, I was even more eager to meet this person and see who it was that Milad liked so much. Milad happily accepted my suggestion and said he would definitely invite his friend over the weekend. He then started reminiscing about their past with excitement. The weekend arrived and I finally got to meet the guy. I couldn't believe Milad was waiting for someone like him. Although Milad had advised me not to judge by appearances, it was really hard not to. Alongside that person, there was another guy who was much cleaner and had more normal appearance, named Hussein. But the guy Milad talked about was a bit strange. He seemed like he might be an addict. His under eyes were deeply sunken. He was very thin. His clothes were not impressive and all his teeth were yellow. He looked like his appearance had been ruined by drugs. His name was Mohammed. In contrast, Hussein was very clean and had a fit physique. That night, I didn't like Mohammed at all, but it seemed Milad had no problem with him. When they left, I told Milad, "Wasn't your friend Mohammed a bit strange?" He thought for a moment and then confirmed, "Yes, actually, Hussein said he's become an addict." I was really worried. I didn't want someone addicted to drugs coming in and out of our home. I immediately said we should cut ties with him, but Milad said he wouldn't contact him anymore. But if Mohammed came to him, he wouldn't be able to turn him away. I managed to convince him that this friend was not good for him and that he should keep his distance as much as possible. Several days passed, and one night Hussein came to our home. I liked Hussein. He had a healthy friendship with Milad and was a thoughtful person. It was clear he had better manners than Milad himself. I was able to connect with Hussein better than with Mohammed, and gradually Hussein started coming to our house more frequently. He was single and often visited us. I had no problem with Hussein being around, but Mohammed was completely out of place in our family. Unfortunately, after a while, Mohammed came back to our home and maintained his relationship with Milad. I couldn't stop Milad from keeping in touch with his friend, and he didn't want to ruin their relationship over this issue. Since Milad was logical and trustworthy, I didn't push the matter further. But Hussein, whenever he came over, would advise Milad to distance himself from Muhammad. One night, while Milad was in the bathroom, Hussein came into the kitchen and seriously talked to me, saying, "Be careful with your husband. Muhammad is not a good person." Muhammad's presence in our home increased, and I even felt that Milad had become closer to Muhammad and often invited him over. This made me anxious. One day, I asked Milad to end his relationship with Muhammad, or at least reduce it. But contrary to my expectations, he became angry and said, "Can you stop being so critical? He's my friend. I know you're worried, but it's not necessary. I'm keeping an eye on everything, and I won't let anything happen." It was the first time Milad spoke to me angrily. I stopped arguing and couldn't prevent him from seeing Muhammad. Unfortunately, I lost control of my life. Muhammad's visit increased, and Hussein couldn't prevent it either. I could have addressed this issue earlier, but I didn't. I let things slide, and my life was falling apart. Milad spent a lot of time with Muhammad. Besides meeting at each other's homes, they would also meet outside. I was destroying my love with my own hands. One day, when my son and I went shopping, I asked him to keep an eye on the house as I wouldn't be back until evening. I went shopping and felt increasingly anxious about the house. Eventually, I was so worried that I returned home earlier. I had told Milad I wouldn't bring the key, but I had it in the bottom of my bag, and I unlocked the door to get home sooner. When I opened the door and saw Muhammad in our home, my heart stopped. Milad was still unaware of me, and there were some unusual items on the coffee table. There was something in his mouth, and smoke was coming out of it. Muhammad had easily gotten what he wanted, and Milad had become addicted. That day, I had a big argument at home and kicked Muhammad out, but then I had to face Milad's reaction. The drugs had affected his mind, and he had become extremely irritable. After Muhammad left, Milad shouted at me and spoke badly to me in a way I had never seen before. It was the first time I had seen him act like this. When Milad calmed down, he apologized and promised he would never go near these things again. But he couldn't keep his promise. Our life was heading towards a collapse. Milad continued using drugs, and his appearance kept changing for the worse. He no longer resembled the person I loved. He had become a shadow of his former self. His craving for drugs had increased, and he was touching me more. His work attendance had also become erratic. For many years, I dealt with his condition, and he would quit drugs temporarily, but then return to them. The situation became tiresome, and Milad's promises were empty. He would say he was quitting, and he would quit, but then he would go back to drugs. Our financial situation was getting worse, and my son was growing up. He had reached the age of 14, and seeing his father in such a state was not good for his mental health. Milad had become unbearable for me. The drugs had also affected his mind, and he had become irritable. The last straw was when he had a fight with the landlord over overdue rent. And the landlord said if we didn't pay by the end of the month, he would throw our belongings out. By the end of the month, I couldn't endure living with Milad any longer. It was also not good for my child. I got a divorce from him and told the court about Milad's issues so that I could get custody of my child. Finally, life started to show me a better side, and I was able to regain custody of my son. After that, I went to work and was struggling with my expenses. The only house I had was my grandmother's old house, which was in very poor condition but better than nothing. We managed to stay together, but it was really tough for me. I was still in touch with Hussein and complained about Milad. During the time I was alone, Hussein would talk to me, and his presence gave me a sense of security, as if I finally had someone to talk to. My relationship with Hussein was going well and he was helping me a lot, but sometimes I didn't like the way he looked at me. One night when I had invited him to our home, he was wearing black clothes and looked very attractive. As we were calmly having dinner together, I felt his eyes lingering on my neckline. I adjusted my clothes and covered that part to hide it from his view, but he kept looking at me. I didn't like his gaze. I didn't expect him to change so suddenly. He was not like this at all, and this behavior was very unlike him. But that night he had an unsettling gaze. After that night, I tried not to be too friendly with him, responded less to his messages, and didn't answer his calls so he wouldn't contact me anymore. I didn't invite him to our home anymore and just focused on my life. Going to work, taking care of the child, and cooking was very hard. I couldn't handle my life. The workload was overwhelming and I had no one to support me. And my child had just turned 15. One night I was so exhausted and unwell that I couldn't avoid talking to Hussein. I needed to talk to someone and the only person I had was Hussein. I just wanted to talk to someone and Hussein was there for me. I messaged him and told him about my situation. He, as always, talked to me and tried to help me calm down, but I was under a lot of pressure and didn't feel at ease about my life. I told him that I felt a bigger problem was coming in the future and I wouldn't be able to fix it. But he tried to calm me down and I was really grateful to him. Suddenly he continued the conversation and said, "Is the only problem that work is hard for you?" Of course, work had its benefits, but not a job where I left in the morning and come back late at night. I told him that I liked working because I needed it, but working from morning till night was tough, and it left me with no energy. He said, "I have a job offer for you. You don't need to go anywhere. You can do it from home. The salary is double what you're making now." I was very happy. I thought if he had such a job, why didn't he tell me about it sooner? I said I would do it no matter what. But the moment he made his proposal, all my happiness disappeared. He wanted me to stay in touch with him every few days. I was very naive not to realize his intentions at first. I was really very naive. I said, "I'm sorry for having thoughts differently about you." I was immediately bombarded with messages from him. He tried to present himself in a better light, saying, "I just like you, that's all. It's not a crime. I'm even worried about you. You don't need to work anymore." His words were constantly echoing in my mind. He wasn't saying anything too bad. After all, I was divorced and no one was willing to come near me anymore. I had a child, and my living conditions were tough. It would have been good if someone like Hussein were in my life, but I quickly pushed these thoughts out of my mind. I shouldn't be doing this. It wasn't right to involve someone else given my situation. I turned him down and didn't reply to his messages anymore. A few days passed and I was really tired from work. My son was getting older and his expenses were increasing. I couldn't manage his costs. In the end, I had to message Hussein again. I couldn't live like this. I wrote back quickly, "Your condition is accepted." Honestly, after accepting the condition, I felt good. I thought Hussein might be a good person, maybe different from my father or my ex-husband. Maybe over time I could fall in love with him and we could build a good life together. I started a relationship with Hussein. As he had promised, he took good care of me and paid me a high salary. Whenever my son went to school, Hussein would come to our house and we would take care of things. Afterward, he would transfer a lot of money to me and continue to show attention. But one day, Hussein came to our house early in the morning as usual. We couldn't do anything in my son's presence. After all, he was my child, and if he saw these scenes, it would be upsetting. When my son came home, he said he was going to his friend's house and wouldn't be back until evening. so I allowed Hussein to stay. After my son left, Hussein took off his clothes and we were both on the rest. We hadn't even started when the door opened and my son walked in. For a moment, the three of us were in shock, looking at each other. My son was looking at us with anger. I quickly grabbed my clothes and ran to the room to cover myself. I hadn't expected it to turn out this way. Otherwise, I would never have allowed Hussein to come to our house. It was too late, and my selflessness had caused me trouble. When I came out of the room, I saw my son alone. Hussein had left, and my son was staring at a point. For a few minutes, I just watched him until he finally picked up his phone and stormed out angrily. After that, no matter how hard I tried to talk to him, he wouldn't respond. I was embarrassed. I messaged Hussein and told him that if we were going to do anything, he should be at my house, and he agreed. Finally, one day I gathered my courage and decided to talk to my son. He needed to know the truth. That day, he had been hiding in his room and wouldn't come out. I placed my hand on the door and opened it. When I entered, I saw my son standing in front of me. I didn't dare move closer. My son was wearing underwear and was holding something. I couldn't believe it. My phone fell from my hand, and as it hit the ground, I looked up, and he was frozen. There was a camera facing him, and someone was behind the camera. I moved a little closer and stared at the screen in front of him. It was his friend. I was shocked by the situation. My son didn't do anything for a moment, but then he reacted angrily. He said, "I reacted because I saw you with a stranger." But the reaction wasn't just because of this. If I had seen my son with a girl, I wouldn't have reacted this way. The problem was the situation I had seen. That's when I realized that his friend wasn't just a friend, but his boyfriend. I was silent. I still couldn't say anything. He took advantage of my silence and said, "You know what? My life is my own business. I will have relationship with whoever I want, just like you have with others." Then he got dressed and left the house. I had no words for him. If I had argued, it would have made things worse. I felt helpless. My mind couldn't grasp anything further. My life was more tangled than ever. I decided to forget about Hussein. Being with Hussein had dragged my life further into the mud, and I was losing my son. I sent a general message to him and ended our relationship. I waited for my son until night, but he didn't come home. I was extremely anxious. I was about to cry when the door opened, and he finally came home. But he wasn't alone. There was another boy with him. The same boy who had been on the call, and my son was showing himself to him. Before I could say anything, I was met with my son's angry glare. If I had said something, I would have embarrassed myself in front of his friend. I tried to smile and forget about their relationship. Neither of them greeted me. It seemed like they both knew that what was going on. It wasn't fair to me. I was just taking care of my son and had to get involved with that situation. But my son was being unkind. They both went to my son's room and closed the door. That night, while I was sleeping, I woke up to the sound of my son's cries. The room was lit, and they were both engaged in something. I couldn't believe my son was doing something. He shouldn't be right next to me. The next morning, after his boyfriend left, my son and I were alone. I had to go back to my previous job, and my son's friends were no longer at the house. My return to work didn't take long because Hussein proposed to me and said he really cared about me. I didn't ask my son for his opinion anymore. By then, he had already disrespected me enough. I just informed him that I was getting married and briefly explained everything to him. Even though he wasn't listening, I felt it was necessary to talk to him about it. Hussein and I signed a few documents and moved into his house without any celebration. We sold my grandmother's house and managed to add its value to Hussein's money to buy a larger home. Although Hussein was financially stable, the house was very expensive. My son continued with his activities for a while, but gradually, as he grew older, he left those activities behind. He even became closer to me and talked to me much more than before. In the early days of Hussein being in our lives, my son didn't like him much, but he soon realized that Hussein was not as he had initially thought and that he had misjudged him from the start. Eventually, my son improved and I no longer saw him having a relationship with people of his own gender. He talked more with girls and even spoke highly of the girls from his university. We became a better family together and none of us knew that one day the three of us would be gathered like this.